everyone, and welcome back. You know we like to go deep around here. And today we're diving into a book called Feminism Exposed, The Dangerous Agenda Destroying Masculinity. It was by Conrad Reicher. And I think, especially given what I know about your interests, this is going to be right up your alley. I mean, the whole idea here is Reicher's taking a look at modern feminism, and he's arguing that it's kind of gone off the rails a little bit, deviated from the original goals. And he says it's actually harming men now. And he thinks it's harming traditional family structures as well.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how he kind of contrasts these early feminist figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were really focused on equal rights, things like voting. And he contrasts that with what he sees as this more radical shift in the movement that happened later on. And he even goes so far as to say that modern feminism has gotten heavily influenced by Marxist ideology.
Okay, that's a bold claim. How does he connect those two? Feminism and Marxism.
Well, he suggests that both ideologies kind of zero in on these power dynamics and oppression. But instead of focusing on class struggle the way traditional Marxism does, Reicher thinks that modern feminism really frames this power imbalance as being solely between men and women. Mm-hmm. And so he believes that this shift really moved the movement away from just basic equality and more towards this view of men as oppressors.
So he's saying it's gone from uplifting women to kind of tearing down men.
Yeah, that's kind of his core argument. One of the most striking examples he uses is the wage gap. You familiar with that? The statistic that women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. He calls it a myth.
Whoa, wait, seriously, I've always heard that statistic used to prove, inequality in the workplace.
Right, it's a very common argument. But Reicher argues that it's actually misleading because it doesn't factor in things like the types of jobs that men and women choose, or the hours they work, or their experience level. In fact, he even points out that when you look at the 25 to 34 age bracket, women actually make more than men on average.
Oh, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way. So is he saying there's no inequality at all then?
Not necessarily, no. He acknowledges that societal expectations and, historical disadvantages might still play a role. But he believes the wage gap itself is this statistical fallacy that's used to further a very specific narrative. And this actually ties directly into his larger point about the family structure being under attack.
Okay, I'm starting to see how he's connecting those things now. So how does he tie that wage gap idea into the family structure?
Well, he argues that this whole narrative of female oppression, that's kind of built around the wage gap. He argues that it's actually contributed to policies and ideas that weaken the traditional family unit. For example, he cites some pretty alarming statistics, like the fact that close to 1/3 of families with children under 18 are headed by single mothers now.
Third? Wow. Yeah. That is a big number.
It is. And he links that to all sorts of societal issues. Higher crime rates, increased poverty, even social unrest. He really believes that the breakdown of the traditional family is a direct result of modern feminism's influence.
It's a pretty bleak picture he's painting.
Yeah.
So does he offer any solutions, or is it just all doom and gloom?
Oh, no, he does offer solutions. Yeah. But first, he kind of dives deeper into the problems that he sees. So, for example, he argues that masculinity itself is being vilified in modern society.
In what ways?
Well, he points to examples in pop culture, education, even the workplace. He argues that men are often depicted as either incompetent or straight-up villains in movies and TV shows, which can obviously influence how young boys view themselves.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. A lot of bumbling dad characters out there.
Exactly. And then in education, he argues that schools are becoming increasingly feminized and that they favor learning styles that might not be as beneficial for boys. And this leads to things like lower academic performance among males.
So you're saying the system is kind of set up to fail boys in a way.
That's his argument. Yeah. And he even critiques affirmative action policies in the workplace, saying they often unfairly favor women, which denies men opportunities and hinders the development of positive male role models.
Wow, he's really connecting the dots between a lot of different areas of society here.
He is, and he goes even further. He explores the #MeToo movement, which he believes has eroded due process in some cases.
Yeah, that's a sensitive topic for sure. What kind of examples does he use there?
Well, he talks about how men are sometimes immediately judged and punished based on accusations alone, even before any investigation or trial takes place. A specific example he cites is James Damore, the Google engineer who was fired for suggesting that biological differences might explain the gender gap in tech.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember that case. That caused a lot of controversy.
It did. And Reicher uses it to illustrate what he sees as a trend of silencing men who challenge the dominant narrative about gender.
So he's not just critiquing feminism itself, but also highlighting the pushback against it.
Exactly. He delves into the rise of what he calls the manosphere, which encompasses groups like the Red Pill movement and men's rights activists, or MRAs.
Can you explain that a little bit? For someone who might not be familiar with those terms, What is the manosphere all about?
So, manosphere is kind of an umbrella term for these various online communities that focus on men's rights and often critique feminist ideology.
Okay.
So these groups, they challenge the narrative presented by what they see as radical feminism, and they advocate for issues affecting men, such as divorce laws, child custody arrangement, false accusations, things like that. And Riker explores these movements in detail, providing some insight into their origins and their motivations.
So it sounds like he's trying to understand the bigger picture of how men are responding to all these changes he's described.
He is. And this leads him to one of the most intriguing aspects of his argument, which is evolutionary psychology.
Okay, how does that fit into all of this?
Well, he argues that understanding the natural, the evolved differences between men and women, can offer valuable insights into their behavior and their roles in society.
So it's not just societal constructs he's talking about.
Right. He suggests that men and women have developed different traits throughout history that were advantageous for survival, and that these differences continue to influence us today.
So he's not saying that men and women are completely different,
Right.
but that biology plays a role.
Exact. He's advocating for a more balanced approach to gender relations, one that recognizes both the differences and the shared humanity between men and women.
That makes sense. It's not about erasing our differences, but understanding them
Right.
and respecting them.
Exactly. And ultimately, he believes that modern feminism has gone too far in its rejection of traditional gender roles, which has led to all the problems he outlines in the book.
So we've kind of gone through his critique of modern feminism. But what does he propose as a way forward? What are his solutions?
Well, that's what we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive. He has some very specific and sometimes controversial ideas about education reform, the role of fathers, and even how masculinity is portrayed in media.
This has been a really thought-provoking discussion so far, and I'm definitely eager to hear more about those solutions.
Yeah, so picking up where we left off, Riker doesn't just, leave us with this bleak diagnosis. He actually offers what he calls a roadmap for reclaiming masculinity and restoring balance in gender relations.
Okay, so what's the prescription?
Well, one of the first things he tackles is the education system. He believes that we need to reform how boys are taught to better suit their learning styles and needs. He argues that the current system, which he sees as increasingly feminized, is failing boys.
And we talked about that earlier. You know how he thinks that schools are kind of set up in a way to disadvantage boys? But what specific changes does he suggest?
Well, he has a few key ideas. First, he advocates for more single-sex schools, arguing that boys thrive in environments where they're not competing with girls for attention and approval.
Interesting. And that ties into his point about, healthy competition being a natural part of masculinity.
Exactly. He also calls for a greater emphasis on hands-on learning, physical activity, and mentorship programs specifically designed for boys.
So less sitting still and memorizing and more active, engaging learning.
Precisely. He believes that this would help boys develop their natural strengths and talents, which he argues are often stifled in the current system.
That sounds like a pretty radical overhaul of the education system. What else is on his agenda?
Another big one is addressing fatherlessness. Riker is very adamant that we need to make it easier for fathers to be actively involved in their children's lives.
Which makes sense given the statistics he cited about the rise of single motherhood. Does he have any concrete solutions for that?
He does. He calls for reforms to family law, suggesting shared parenting arrangements as the default in custody cases.
So less of this automatic assumption that the mother should be the primary caregiver.
Yes. He argues that the current system often unfairly favors mothers, making it difficult for fathers to maintain a strong presence in their children's lives.
Does he address how societal expectations might contribute to that? This idea that men are supposed to be the breadwinners while women are the primary caregiver.
He does. Riker argues that these traditional gender roles, while perhaps helpful in the past, are now outdated and harmful. And he suggests that we need to challenge these norms and create a more equitable division of labor within families. He also advocates for policies that encourage fathers to take paternity leave and be more involved in childcare from day one.
So it's about redefining what it means to be a good father in modern society.
Absolutely. He argues that involved fathers benefit everyone, children, families, and society as a whole. He sees it as crucial for restoring balance in gender relations.
So we've got education reform, we've got this focus on fatherhood. What else is on Riker's agenda for reclaiming masculinity?
Well, he also dives into the realm of media and popular culture. He argues that we need to challenge the negative portrayals of men that are so pervasive in movie, TV shows, advertising.
Right, and he gave those pretty stark examples of how men are often shown as either incompetent or villainous. So how do we change that?
Well, he calls for more balanced and nuanced portrayals of men, highlighting their strengths, their complexities, and their contributions to society.
So less of the bumbling dad stereotype
Yeah.
and more positive male role model.
Exactly. He believes that we need to counteract these negative messages that boys are bombarded with from a young age, showing them that masculinity can be about strength and sensitivity, assertiveness and compassion.
Yeah, I can see how those positive representations would be crucial, especially for young men who are still forming their own sense of identity.
Absolutely. And it's not just fictional portrayals. Riker also addresses how men are depicted in news coverage and social media.
And this is where his critique of the Me Too movement comes into play, right?
Yes. While he supports addressing sexual harassment and assault, he's concerned that the movement has, in some cases, led to a rush to judgment and a presumption of guilt against men.
And he used the example of James Damore, the Google engineer. It's definitely a sensitive topic. There are strong opinions on both sides.
There are, and it's important to acknowledge that the Me Too movement has brought much needed attention to the issue of sexual harassment and assault. However, Riker argues that we need to be careful not to swing the pendulum too far in the other direction.
So he's advocating for a more balanced approach that respects the rights of both the accused and the accuser.
Precisely. He believes that due process is fundamental and that accusations should be investigated thoroughly before judgments are made or punishments are handed down.
So it sounds like he's trying to walk this fine line, acknowledging the importance of the movement, but also raising concerns about potential overreach.
He is, and this ties into his broader argument about the dangers of what he calls radical feminism, which he sees as hostile to men and traditional values. He argues that this ideology has gained significant influence in our institutions and media.
It's a pretty strong claim. Does he offer any evidence to support that?
He does. Throughout the book, he cites examples from academia, law, and popular culture that he believes demonstrate this influence. He also discusses the rise of the manosphere, which he sees as a direct reaction to what he calls the excesses of radical feminism.
So he's not saying that all feminism is bad, just this particular strain that he sees as harmful.
Exactly. He acknowledges that early feminists fought for important rights and made valuable contributions to society. However, he believes that modern feminism has, in some cases, gone too far and lost sight of its original goals.
So it sounds like he's calling for a more moderate, balanced approach to gender relations, one that recognizes the legitimate concerns of both men and women.
He is, and he argues that this is essential for creating a society that is fair and just for everyone.
Okay, so we've kind of gone through the problems he sees with modern society and the negative consequences of what he calls radical feminism. What are his solutions? What does he propose we actually do about all of this?
That's a great question, and it's something he addresses in detail in the book. But, it goes beyond just societal and structural changes. He also emphasizes the importance of men working on themselves, developing their own sense of self-worth and purpose.
So it's not just about changing society, it's about men changing themselves as well.
Exactly. Riker encourages men to embrace their masculinity, to cultivate their strengths, and to find healthy ways to express their emotions. He argues that men need to take responsibility for their own lives and not fall into the trap of victimhood.
So it's like this kind of self-reliance and personal accountability that's often missing in today's culture.
It is. And he also stresses the importance of male bonding and mentorship.
I'm curious to hear more about that. What role do those relationships play in his view?
Well, he believes that men need strong, supportive relationships with other men. In order to thrive, he encourages men to seek out mentors, join men's groups, engage in activities that foster a sense of camaraderie and purpose.
So building that sense of brotherhood and community, almost like a counterbalance to the negative influences he sees coming from society at large.
Exactly. He believes that these strong male bonds can provide men with the support and guidance they need to navigate the challenges of modern life and become the best versions of themselves.
This is all really fascinating. It seems like his solutions touch on so many different aspects of life, from education and family to personal development and social connections.
He definitely takes a holistic approach, and it's all tied together by this central idea of reclaiming masculinity and restoring balance in gender relations.
Now, I know Riker's work is pretty controversial. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who disagree with him. Does he address any of those criticisms?
He does. He acknowledges that his views are not mainstream, and that some people will find them offensive or even dangerous. However, he argues that it's important to have these difficult conversations and to challenge the status quo.
He's not afraid of ruffling some feathers?
Not at all. He believes that open and honest dialogue is essential for progress, even if it means upsetting some people along the way.
Yeah, I admire his willingness to speak his mind, even on such sensitive topics. Now, in the last part of our deep dive, I'm really eager to hear more about how Riker's ideas have been received. and what impact his book has had on the conversation about gender.
That's a great point to explore. And we can also delve deeper into some of the criticisms and alternative perspectives on the issues he raised. There's definitely a lot more to unpack.
I can't wait. This has been a truly eye-opening discussion so far. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Feminism Exposed. We've explored Riker's critiques of modern feminism, his concerns about, the vilification of masculinity, and his call for men to kind of reclaim their strength and purpose. But I guess the question is, where do we go from here? What does a healthy, balanced approach to gender relations actually look like in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something that a lot of people are grappling with right now. I mean, we're in this era of really rapid social change, and the traditional roles of men and women are being redefined, which can be exciting, but also a bit unsettling,
It definitely feels like we're at a crossroads, trying to figure out how to move forward in a way that's fair and equitable for everyone.
And I think Riker's book, while controversial, does offer some thought-provoking ideas on how we might navigate this new landscape. One of his central points is that we need to move beyond these narratives of victimhood and oppression that so often dominate discussions about gender.
He seems to think both sides have gotten kind of stuck in this cycle of blame and resentment.
Exactly. He argues that both men and women have faced unique challenges throughout history, and both have made significant contributions to society. So instead of dwelling on past wrongs, he encourages us to focus on creating a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive regardless of gender.
It sounds like a positive vision, but how do we actually get there? Especially when there's so much disagreement about, even the root of the problem.
Well, Riker believes that a crucial step is acknowledging the complexities of gender. We need to recognize that there are inherent differences between men and women, but also understand that those differences don't have to be a source of conflict or division.
It's about finding that balance, recognizing and respecting our differences without using them to, create hierarchies or power struggles.
Precisely. Riker makes a compelling case for embracing those differences, celebrating the unique strengths and qualities that both men and women bring to the table.
Right, and he's really big on men reclaiming their masculinity, embracing their strength, their courage, their protectiveness. But I remember him emphasizing that it's not about reverting to some outdated macho stereotype.
Absolutely not. He's not advocating for a man up or boys don't cry mentality. He envisions a more nuanced and evolved masculinity, one that embodies both strength and sensitivity, assertiveness and compassion.
So finding that sweet spot,
Yeah.
where men can be strong and assertive, but also empathetic and caring.
Exactly. And he argues that this kind of masculinity is essential for men to be good fathers, partner, members of society. It's about finding a balance between the traditional strengths associated with masculinity and the emotional intelligence needed to navigate the complexities of modern relationships.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he doesn't shy away from talking about emotion. In fact, he encourages men to be more in touch with their feelings and to express them in healthy ways.
He does, and I think that's one of the things that makes his book so compelling. He's not just preaching from this position of authority. He's speaking from a place of personal experience. He shares his own struggles, his own insecurities, his own journey of self-discovery.
Right, and that vulnerability makes his message more relatable, especially for men who might feel pressured to conform to those traditional stoic ideals of masculinity.
Absolutely. He shows that it's okay for men to be vulnerable, to ask for help, and to express a full range of emotions.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with? What should they be thinking about as they kind of move forward?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that this conversation about gender is far from over. It's an ongoing process, and there are no easy answers. It's complex, it's evolving, and it requires open minds and a willingness to challenge our assumptions.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. We can't just shut down the conversation because it's uncomfortable or challenging. We need to keep talking, keep listening, guiding, keep learning.
Exactly. And I think Riker's book, even if you disagree with parts of it, serves as a catalyst for that conversation. It challenges us to think critically about our own beliefs, examine how, culture contributes to the issues we face, and consider, fresh perspectives and solutions.
It's about looking inward at ourselves and outward at society and trying to understand how everything fits together.
It is. And ultimately, I think it reminds us that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of gender relations. It's not just about men or women. It's about all of us working together to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Well said. And if anyone wants to delve deeper into these ideas, we highly recommend checking out Conrad Riker's book, Feminism Exposed, The Dangerous Agenda Destroying Masculinity. You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's a book that will definitely challenge your thinking and spark some lively discussion.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you from our deep dive? What questions do you still have? Join the conversation on our social media channels, and let's keep this dialogue going.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.